Hello there, fellow truth seekers. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're having a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world. I'm grateful you're here with us. If this is your first time listening to Sleep Theories, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories they don't want you to know. Now, let's uncover a truth that's been buried for decades. My name is Rachel Linwood, and I'm about to tell you something that will change how you think about environmental disasters forever. I'm 35, a freelance journalist who specialises in environmental research, and 3 months ago, I thought I was investigating a simple case of corporate negligence. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Standing on what used to be 99th Street in Love Canal, New York, I watched weeds push through cracked asphalt where children once played. The October wind carried a smell I couldn't quite place, something sweet and chemical, like old paint mixed with decay. Nature was reclaiming this poisoned ground, but slowly, carefully, as if even the plants knew something was terribly wrong here. They called it a tragedy. The textbooks, the documentaries, the official reports, they all paint the same picture of corporate irresponsibility and government oversight failure. But the deeper I dug into the files, the witness testimonies, the timeline of events, the more I realised that what happened here wasn't an accident. It wasn't negligence. It was something else entirely. Something planned, something deliberate, something that goes to the very heart of how our government views its own citizens. The official story is neat, contained, sanitised for public consumption. But the real story is still buried beneath layers of classified documents, sealed court records, and the testimonies of people who've been told to stay quiet for nearly 50 years. This is that story. Let me start with what they want you to know. In the early 1940s, Hooker Chemical Company began using an abandoned canal in Niagara Falls, New York, as a dump site for industrial waste. Over the course of more than a decade, they buried approximately 21,000 tons of chemical waste in steel drums, then covered it with clay and soil. In 1953, facing pressure from a growing population and the need for new schools, the Niagara Falls School Board approached Hooker Chemical about purchasing the land. Hooker sold the property for the symbolic price of $1, but here's where the official story gets interesting. They included a clause in the deed that absolved them of any future liability for the buried chemicals. They warned the school board. They told them about the waste. The school board built anyway. By the 1970s, residents in the area began reporting an unusual number of health problems. Birth defects, miscarriages, cancer clusters, mysterious rashes, and neurological issues plagued the community. Children playing in their backyards developed chemical burns. Basements filled with strange-smelling sludge during heavy rains. In 1978, after mounting pressure from residents and media attention, President Jimmy Carter declared Love Canal a federal health emergency. It was the first time in US history that such a declaration was made for a man-made disaster. Hundreds of families were evacuated, their homes purchased by the government, their neighbourhood turned into a ghost town. That's the official story. Corporate greed, government incompetence, innocent victims. A tragedy, yes, but ultimately a lesson learned about proper waste disposal and environmental protection. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not for me. Not when I started finding documents that didn't fit the narrative. My first clue came from a Freedom of Information Act request I filed with the EPA. I was looking for routine correspondence about the cleanup efforts, expecting to find bureaucratic memos about soil samples and water testing. Instead, buried in a stack of heavily redacted documents, I found a memo dated March 15th, 1956, 22 years before the federal health emergency. The memo from an EPA predecessor agency referenced ongoing health monitoring protocols and baseline establishment for long-term exposure studies. They knew. They knew in 1956 what those chemicals would do to people, but they told the public in 1978. I started making phone calls to former residents, many now scattered across the country. Most wouldn't talk. Those who had shared stories that never made it into the official reports. Stories about government officials taking soil samples from their yards in the early 1960s without explanation. Stories about forms they were asked to fill out about their children's behaviour and health. Forms that were supposedly for routine community health surveys that no other neighbourhood seemed to receive. Margaret Kowalski, now 83 and living in Buffalo, remembered it clearly. They came with clipboards, she told me over the phone, her voice still sharp despite her age. Official-looking men in suits. They asked about Tommy's grades, about his moods, about whether he had trouble sleeping or concentrating. Said it was for some university study. But why just our neighbourhood? Why just us? Why indeed? The deeper I dug, the more questions arose. My FOIA requests to various agencies began yielding fragments of documents from the 1960s. Most so heavily redacted they looked like abstract art in black marker, but occasionally a phrase would slip through, a sentence that didn't belong in routine environmental monitoring reports. One document from 1963, originating from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, mentioned bio-response tracking and controlled exposure zone establishment. Another, from 1965, contained a budget line item for behavioural assessment protocols, Love Canal site. But the document that stopped me cold was an engineer's memo from 1961. The engineer, whose name was redacted, was writing to his supervisor about irregularities he'd noticed during what appeared to be routine soil surveys at Love Canal. The memo read, "Continued anomalies in disposal patterns suggest multiple origin points. Barrels in Sector 7 unmarked with company identifiers. Chemical composition inconsistent with hooker manifest logs. Unknown origin of approximately 200 containers discovered during September survey. No record of transfer from hooker chemical to disposal site. Recommend investigation into non-corporate depositor." Non-corporate depositor. That phrase haunted me for weeks. Who else had been dumping chemicals at Love Canal? And why weren't they mentioned in any of the official histories? I started cross-referencing dates with other government activities in the area during the early 1950s. That's when I found the connection to Plum Island Animal Disease Centre, the federal research facility located on a small island off the coast of Long Island. Plum Island, officially dedicated to studying animal diseases, has long been the subject of speculation about biological weapons research. Transportation logs from 1951 and 1952, obtained through a separate FOIA request, showed regular truck convoys travelling from Plum Island to various disposal sites in upstate New York. The logs listed Love Canal as a secondary containment location for overflow materials. The timing was perfect. Just before Hooker sold the land to the school board, just as families were beginning to move into the area in larger numbers. Someone had been using Love Canal as a dump site for materials that weren't supposed to exist, materials that came from facilities conducting research that wasn't supposed to be happening. But materials for what? And more importantly, were the families who moved there really victims of an accident? Or were they participants in an experiment they never consented to? 3 weeks into my investigation, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was gravelly, careful, belonging to a man who identified himself only as Robert, and claimed to be a retired Army logistics officer. He'd heard about my research through mutual contacts in the veterans community and wanted to meet. We met at a diner in Syracuse, far enough from Love Canal to feel safe, close enough that Robert could point toward Niagara Falls and say, "That's where they tested it." Robert, who appeared to be in his 70s and wore the careful posture of a man who'd spent decades keeping secrets, had worked in chemical logistics for the Army from 1949 to 1975. His job involved coordinating the disposal of various materials from research facilities, including Plum Island, Fort Detrick, and smaller laboratories scattered across the northeast. Love Canal wasn't just a dump site, he told me over coffee that grew cold as his story unfolded. It was overflow from other projects that were generating waste faster than we could process it through normal channels. According to Robert, in the early days of the Cold War, the military was conducting extensive research into what they called area denial compounds, chemicals that could be used to incapacitate enemy forces or civilian populations without permanent damage. The research was part of a broader program that included psychological warfare, crowd control, and what military documents euphemistically called population management techniques. Robert explained, the problem was disposal. These weren't standard industrial chemicals. They were experimental compounds, some designed to affect neurological function, others to disrupt behavioural patterns. You couldn't just pour them down a drain or bury them in a regular landfill. They needed special containment, special monitoring. But budget constraints and the sheer volume of waste being generated by multiple research programs meant that some materials ended up in civilian disposal sites. Love Canal, with its existing industrial waste and planned development, provided perfect cover. The beauty of it, Robert said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disgust, was that if anyone ever got sick, it would look like industrial contamination. Hooker Chemical would take the blame. The real research materials would disappear into the background noise. When I asked Robert about monitoring, his expression darkened. You don't dump experimental chemicals and walk away. You monitor, you study the effects, you collect data. That's when he told me about the school. According to Robert, the decision to build the 99th Street Elementary School directly on top of the waste site wasn't just cost-saving or poor planning, it was strategic. Schools provided perfect monitoring opportunities, regular health checkups, academic performance tracking, behavioural assessments, and parental questionnaires about children's development. You want to know the long-term effects of low-level chemical exposure on developing minds? Robert asked. Build a school on top of your dump site and watch the kids for 20 years. I left the diner with more questions than answers, but Robert had given me a new direction for my research. I started looking for evidence of systematic monitoring at Love Canal, and I found it in the most unlikely place, a university archive. Buried in the papers of a retired psychology professor at the University at Buffalo, I discovered a folder labelled Niagara Region Behavioural Study, 1971 to 1976. The study, funded by a grant from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, tracked behavioural patterns, academic performance, and social development among elementary school children in the Love Canal area. The study's methodology was sophisticated, comparing Love Canal children to control groups from other neighbourhoods and tracking dozens of variables over multiple years. But what struck me wasn't the thoroughness of the research, it was the timing. The study began in 1971, 7 years before the health emergency was declared, at a time when officials supposedly didn't know there was any danger. The study's conclusions, buried in academic language and statistical analysis, painted a disturbing picture. Children in the Love Canal area showed higher rates of attention deficit, learning disabilities, aggressive behaviour, and what the researchers termed socialisation difficulties compared to control groups. But here's the truly chilling part. The study's recommendations section suggested that the behavioural differences observed in Love Canal children might be useful for developing environmental management techniques for future urban planning projects. They weren't just watching the children suffer, they were learning from it. As my research deepened, I kept encountering references to dates and programs that seemed familiar. The timeline of Love Canal's development, from initial chemical dumping in the early 1950s through the health emergency in 1978, overlapped almost perfectly with one of the most notorious government programs in American history, MK-Ultra. MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control research program, operated from 1953 to 1973. While most people know about the LSD experiments and psychological torture techniques developed under MK-Ultra, fewer are aware of its sister program, MK-Naomi, which focused on biological and chemical weapons research. A document I obtained through a FOIA request to the CIA, released in 2001 but heavily redacted, contained a section titled Phase B, Environmental Delivery Systems. The document, dated 1958, outlined research into chemical influence trials utilizing environmental integration methods with specific reference to upstate New York test sites. The language was bureaucratic and clinical, but the implications were clear. The CIA was researching ways to deliver mind-altering chemicals through environmental exposure, contaminated water supplies, soil contamination, and airborne dispersal. They needed test sites where they could monitor long-term effects on human subjects without those subjects knowing they were being tested. Love Canal fit the profile perfectly. I found additional confirmation in the personal papers of Dr. Ewan Cameron, the psychiatrist who conducted some of MK-Ultra's most notorious experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. In a letter dated 1956, Cameron mentioned collaborative research opportunities with Army Chemical Corps regarding environmental exposure protocols, and referenced meetings with officials regarding the Niagara Project. The Niagara Project. Not Niagara Falls in general, the Niagara Project singular, specific, deliberate. But the smoking gun came from an unlikely source. the personal diary of a mid-level CIA administrator named James Morrison, whose papers were donated to a university library by his family after his death in 1998. Morrison's diary entries from 1962 to 1965 contained casual references to visiting the Canal site and reviewing behavioural modification data from the school population. One entry, dated September 1963, was particularly revealing. Visited Canal site with Dr. Patterson. Children's behavioural data shows promising results. Attention span reduction averaging 23% compared to control groups. Memory formation appears impaired but not catastrophically. Recommend continuation of current exposure levels through 1968 academic year. They were experimenting on children. For years. Deliberately exposing them to chemicals designed to alter their cognitive function and behavioural patterns, then studying the results like lab rats in a maze. But why? What was the ultimate goal of creating a generation of cognitively impaired children in a small working-class neighbourhood in upstate New York? The answer, I believe, lies in the broader context of Cold War domestic policy and the government's growing interest in what military planners called population management. As I continued my research, a disturbing pattern emerged. Love Canal wasn't randomly selected for this massive human experiment. It was carefully chosen based on the demographics of its residents. The neighbourhood was predominantly working class, with a high percentage of immigrants from Eastern Europe. Many residents had limited education and few resources to challenge government authority. They were, in the cold calculation of social planners, ideal test subjects, numerous enough to provide statistically significant data, isolated enough to contain any problems, and powerless enough to be safely ignored if things went wrong. Internal documents from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, obtained through a FOIA request, revealed that alternative sites for the 99th Street Elementary School were considered and rejected. 3 other locations were deemed more suitable from an engineering perspective, and safer for long-term use. But the Love Canal site was selected because it was more cost-effective and offered unique research opportunities. The HUD documents also revealed something else, the demographic analysis that influenced the site selection. The analysis, conducted in 1952, described the Love Canal area population as stable, compliant, and unlikely to generate adverse publicity. It noted that residents had limited political connections and low propensity for legal action. In other words, they chose Love Canal because they believed the residents wouldn't fight back. This wasn't just environmental racism, it was social engineering on a massive scale. The government had identified a population they considered expendable and used them as test subjects in a multi-decade experiment designed to understand how chemical exposure could be used to control human behaviour. But the experiment went beyond simple chemical exposure. Documents I found in the archives of the Niagara County Health Department revealed systematic efforts to study and manipulate the social dynamics of the Love Canal community. Starting in 1958, government contractors began conducting regular community surveys that were actually designed to measure social cohesion, political awareness, and collective action potential. The surveys tracked which residents were most likely to organise neighbourhood activities, who had influence with local officials, and which families were most trusted by their neighbours. Armed with this information, government agents began subtle interventions designed to disrupt community organisation and prevent residents from collectively identifying the source of their health problems. Natural community leaders were offered jobs that required them to move away from the neighbourhood. Local organisations that might have investigated health issues were either co-opted or undermined through the introduction of divisive personalities. The most chilling document I found was a 1969 memo from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, outlining what they called social fragmentation protocols. The memo described techniques for preventing affected communities from developing coherent narratives of causation and maintaining research integrity through population management. They were actively working to prevent Love Canal residents from understanding what was happening to them. Margaret Kowalski, the former resident I'd spoken with earlier, confirmed this when I called her back with more specific questions. There was always something, she recalled. Right when people started talking about organising a meeting to discuss the health problems, suddenly there'd be some drama. Neighbours would start fighting over property lines, or somebody would spread rumours about someone else having an affair. It was like the community could never come together long enough to focus on what was really important. When I asked Margaret if she remembered any new people moving into the neighbourhood during the 1960s, people who seemed particularly interested in community affairs, her voice got quiet. "There was a couple," she said slowly, "the Richardsons. Moved in around 1965. Real friendly, always organising block parties and trying to get involved in everything. But looking back, they asked a lot of questions about how people felt, who they trusted, what they were worried about, and they never seemed to get sick like the rest of us. Social engineering, population control, human experimentation disguised as urban development. The scope of what had been done to the Love Canal community was staggering, but I was beginning to understand that it was just one part of a larger program designed to study and control American civilian populations. The question was, how far did it go? And more importantly, was it still happening? In 1980, 2 years after President Carter's health emergency declaration, Love Canal became one of the first sites designated under the newly created Superfund program. The cleanup, which officially lasted until 2004, cost over $400 million and involved removing contaminated soil, installing drainage systems, and constructing a complex containment system around the remaining buried waste. But as I researched the cleanup process, I found evidence that the real goal wasn't environmental remediation, it was evidence destruction. The first red flag was the secrecy surrounding the cleanup operations. Unlike most Superfund sites, where cleanup activities are heavily documented and open to public scrutiny, Love Canal was designated a national security sensitive site, allowing federal agencies to classify most records related to the cleanup process. Former EPA contractor Michael Torres, who worked on the Love Canal cleanup from 1985 to 1990, agreed to speak with me on condition of anonymity. According to Torres, large portions of the cleanup involved activities that had nothing to do with environmental protection. "We weren't just removing contaminated soil," Torres explained during a phone conversation. "There were specific areas where we were told to locate and extract particular materials, metal containers, file boxes, equipment that looked like monitoring devices. The stuff we pulled out didn't look like industrial waste. It looked like research materials." Torres described finding buried concrete chambers that contained sophisticated monitoring equipment, some of it still functional after decades underground. The chambers were connected to the elementary school through a network of underground cables that had been used to transmit data from sensors placed throughout the school building. They had been monitoring everything, Torres said. Air quality in individual classrooms, chemical concentrations in the playground soil, even the drinking water fountains. Everything was wired up like a giant laboratory. The monitoring equipment and data storage devices were immediately classified and removed by federal agents. Torres and his fellow workers were required to sign additional confidentiality agreements and were told that discussing what they had found would violate national security laws. But the most disturbing discovery came in 1987, when cleanup crews working in the area beneath the former 99th Street Elementary School uncovered what construction logs described as a vaulted chemical reserve. The chamber, constructed in 1952 according to date stamps on the concrete, contained hundreds of chemical containers that didn't match any of Hooker Chemical's disposal records. The containers bore markings from various military research facilities, including Fort Detrick, the Army's Biological Warfare Center, and laboratory codes that Torres later learned belonged to CIA research contractors. Some containers held chemicals that had never been manufactured for commercial use, compounds that existed only in research laboratories studying behavioral modification and population control. That's when I realized we weren't cleaning up an industrial accident, Torres told me. We were cleaning up the evidence of a government program that was never supposed to have existed. The cleanup crews were ordered to incinerate the military and CIA materials at extremely high temperatures, ensuring that no trace of the original compounds would remain for future analysis. The incineration was conducted under military supervision, and the resulting ash was transported to an undisclosed location for final disposal. Meanwhile, soil samples that might have revealed the true nature and extent of the contamination were altered or destroyed before they could be independently analysed. Community groups that demanded access to cleanup data were told that the information was classified for national security reasons. By 2004, when the cleanup was officially declared complete, virtually all evidence of the government's role in creating and maintaining Love Canal as a human experimentation site had been destroyed. The official narrative of corporate negligence and environmental tragedy remained intact, while the truth was literally buried deeper than before. The cleanup wasn't remediation, it was the final phase of the cover-up. As my investigation progressed, and I began reaching out to more former EPA employees, military contractors, and government officials who might have knowledge of Love Canal's hidden history, I started encountering resistance. The first warning came through a former EPA chemist named Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who had worked on early chemical analysis of Love Canal soil samples in the late 1970s. Dr. Hendricks had been scheduled to testify before Congress in 1982 about irregularities she'd discovered in the official contamination reports, but she suddenly recanted her testimony and left government service without explanation. I tracked Dr. Hendricks down to a small town in Oregon where she'd been living quietly for the past 40 years. When I first called, she hung up immediately. After several attempts, she finally agreed to talk, but only briefly. "I wanted to tell the truth back then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The chemical signatures I found didn't match what they were saying publicly. There were compounds in those soil samples that had never been used in industrial manufacturing, military compounds, research chemicals. But when I tried to include that information in my report, I was told it was classified." Dr. Hendricks told me that she'd been visited at her home by men who identified themselves as federal agents, and were told that her continued employment and her pension depended on her maintaining appropriate discretion regarding national security matters. When I asked if she would be willing to go on the record with what she knew, Dr. Hendricks became agitated. "You don't understand," she said. "They made it clear that my safety, and my family's safety, depended on staying quiet. That was 40 years ago, and I still get Christmas cards from people I've never met, just to remind me that they know where I am." Dr. Hendricks hung up, and when I tried calling back, the phone number had been disconnected. But Dr. Hendricks wasn't the only person who seemed afraid to talk. Over the course of 3 weeks, I contacted 17 former government employees who had worked on Love Canal-related projects during the 1960s, 70s and 80s. 11 of them hung up as soon as I mentioned Love Canal. 4 others listened to my questions, but refused to provide any information. 2 agreed to meet with me, but then failed to show up for our scheduled appointments. The 17th contact was Dr. Robert Chen, a former Army research chemist who had worked at Fort Detrick during the 1950s and 60s. Dr. Chen, now 81 and living in Maryland, initially agreed to speak with me about his work on environmental delivery systems for behavioural modification compounds. We arranged to meet at a restaurant near his home on a Thursday afternoon. I drove down from upstate New York, excited about the prospect of finally getting direct confirmation of the military's involvement in Love Canal from someone who had been part of the programme. Dr. Chen never showed up. When I called his home that evening, his daughter answered and told me that her father had suffered a sudden heart attack and was in intensive care. I offered my condolences and asked her to let me know when he was feeling better, thinking perhaps we could reschedule for a later date. 2 days later, Dr. Chen was dead. His daughter called to inform me of his passing, and mentioned that her father had seemed unusually agitated in the days before his heart attack. He'd been making phone calls to old colleagues, asking questions about projects from the old days, and had seemed worried about something he couldn't quite explain. He kept saying he should have spoken up years ago, she told me. He said there were things people deserved to know, things that had been kept secret too long. The day after Dr. Chen's funeral, I received a voice message on my phone. The caller ID showed unknown number, and the voice was electronically distorted, but the message was clear. "Miss Linwood, you're digging into things that won't help anyone. The people involved in your research are old and deserve to live out their remaining years in peace. The families who lived in Love Canal have moved on with their lives. There's nothing to be gained by reopening wounds that have finally healed. Let sleeping chemicals lie." The message was polite, but the threat was unmistakable. I saved the recording and increased my personal security measures, but I also realised that I was getting close to something that powerful people desperately wanted to keep buried. That night someone broke into my apartment. Nothing was stolen, but my computer had been accessed, and several files related to my Love Canal research had been deleted. Backup files on external drives were also missing. Fortunately, I'd been paranoid enough to keep additional copies in a safety deposit box, but the message was clear. They knew what I was working on, and they could reach me whenever they wanted. I began sleeping in different locations each night, and started communicating with sources only through encrypted channels. The investigation had become dangerous, but I was too close to the truth to stop now. The final confirmation that I was on the right track came when my blog, where I'd been posting updates about my research, was hacked, and all content was deleted. The hackers left a simple message: some stories are better left untold. But I disagree. Some stories are too important to leave untold, no matter how dangerous it becomes to tell them. 3 months after I began this investigation, I returned to Love Canal one last time. The area has been partially redeveloped now. The government has declared it safe for habitation, and new families have moved into homes built on land that was once America's most notorious toxic waste site. Walking through the neighbourhood on a crisp autumn morning, you'd never know what had happened here. The streets are clean, the houses are well maintained, and children play in yards where other children once developed mysterious illnesses and unexplained behavioural problems. But if you know what to look for, the signs are still there. The air still carries that faint sweet smell I'd noticed on my first visit, a chemical sweetness that seems to intensify when the wind shifts in a particular direction. Local residents, when pressed, will admit to occasional health problems that seem unusually common for such a small area. Autoimmune disorders, neurological issues, cancers that appear at unusually young ages. The elementary school was demolished during the clean-up, but its foundation remains visible in satellite photos as a darker rectangular patch in what is now supposed to be a park. Grass grows differently there, forming patterns that seem to follow the layout of the old underground monitoring systems. I spoke with several current residents, most of whom know little about the area's history beyond the official story of industrial contamination and successful clean-up. But a few of the older residents, people who lived through the crisis years of the late 1970s, shared stories that suggest the effects of whatever was buried at Love Canal continue to this day. Maria Santos, who moved to the area in 2010, described health problems that began shortly after her family settled into their new home. Chronic headaches, memory issues, and behavioural changes in her teenage son that reminded me of the symptoms described by residents from the 1970s. The doctors say it's stress, teenage hormones, normal ageing, Maria told me. But my whole family started having problems at the same time, right after we moved here. And it's not just us. A lot of families in the neighbourhood deal with similar issues. When I asked Maria if she'd ever been contacted by government health officials or researchers studying long-term effects of environmental contamination, her expression changed. "How did you know about that?" she asked. "Yes, we get visits sometimes. People with clipboards asking about our health, our children's behaviour, how we're adapting to the neighbourhood. They say it's routine follow-up for the EPA, making sure the clean-up was successful. The monitoring continues. Nearly 50 years after the initial dumping began, nearly 30 years after the supposed clean-up was completed, government agents are still collecting data on the families living in Love Canal, still studying the long-term effects of whatever was buried there, which raises the final, most disturbing question. What if the experiment never ended? What if Love Canal wasn't just a Cold War research project that got out of hand, but rather a prototype for ongoing studies in environmental population control? What if the families living there now aren't just residents of a former Superfund site, but unwitting participants in the next phase of research into how chemical exposure can be used to influence human behaviour and social dynamics? The evidence I've uncovered suggests that Love Canal was never meant to be cleaned up in the traditional sense. It was meant to be managed, controlled, turned into a long-term study site where researchers could observe the multi-generational effects of chemical exposure on human populations. The new residents don't know they're test subjects. The old residents who survived were relocated but never told the full truth about what had been done to them. and the government agencies responsible for the original experiment have spent decades perfecting their ability to monitor populations without detection. Love Canal didn't end in 1978 when President Carter declared a health emergency. It didn't end in 2004 when the EPA declared the cleanup complete. It's still happening, still continuing, still generating data for researchers who view human beings as laboratory animals in a grand experiment in social control. People think Love Canal ended in 1978, but I'm here to tell you, it never ended. The families who lived there were never victims of an industrial accident. They were targets of a government program designed to study how chemical exposure could be weaponized against civilian populations. And we're all still living in its shadow. The chemicals are still there, buried under layers of clay and concrete, but still seeping into the groundwater, still releasing gases into the air, still affecting everyone who lives, works, or visits the area. The monitoring systems are still in place, updated and modernized, but still collecting data on human responses to long-term chemical exposure. Most importantly, the mentality that created Love Canal, the willingness to sacrifice American citizens in the name of national security research, the belief that some populations are expendable in service of larger goals, that mentality is still very much alive in government agencies and research institutions across the country. Love Canal was never about corporate negligence or environmental protection failure. It was about power. The power to conduct secret experiments on unwilling subjects, the power to cover up decades of human rights violations, and the power to continue those experiments indefinitely under the guise of environmental monitoring and public health research. The story of a Love Canal isn't a tragedy, it's not even history, it's an ongoing crime against humanity that continues to this day, hidden beneath layers of official denial and scientific jargon, but still claiming victims, still generating data, still serving the interests of people who view American citizens as expendable resources in their quest for knowledge about behavioural control and population management. And until we acknowledge what really happened there, until we demand accountability for what was done to those families, until we recognise that Love Canal was just one site in a much larger programme of human experimentation that may still be active today, we will all remain potential victims of the same mindset that turned a working-class neighbourhood into a laboratory for studying the effects of chemical warfare on civilian populations. The truth about Love Canal isn't buried in government files or hidden in classified documents. It's still happening, all around us, every day. We just have to be brave enough to see it, and even braver to speak about it. Because the alternative, staying silent, accepting the official story, pretending that our government would never deliberately harm its own citizens, that alternative means that Love Canal will continue, that other sites will be selected, and that other families will become unknowing test subjects in experiments they never consented to participate in. The choice is ours. We can continue to believe the sanitized version of events that protects the guilty and abandons the victims, or we can demand the truth about what was done at Love Canal, and what continues to be done in similar locations across the country. The families of Love Canal deserved better. The families living there now deserve better. And we all deserve a government that doesn't view us as laboratory animals in some grand experiment, in population control and social engineering. The chemicals are still there, the monitoring is still happening, the experiment continues. But now you know, and knowledge, as they say, is power. Use it wisely. Hello there, fellow truth seekers and curious minds. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are in this vast world of ours. Thank you for joining us here at Sleep Theories. What time is it where you are? And more importantly, where in this interconnected yet mysterious world are you tuning in from today? But here's what I'm really curious about. What do you think about the conspiracy we're about to explore? Do you believe it's possible that some of our world leaders might not be who they appear to be? Have you ever noticed something just slightly off about a politician's mannerisms or expressions that made you wonder? And speaking of conspiracies that keep you up at night, what theories would you like us to investigate next? Are you drawn to the mysteries of ancient civilizations and their hidden knowledge? The possibility of secret space programs operating beyond public view? The truth behind a missing time phenomena and memory manipulation? Or perhaps something closer to home? The real story behind social media algorithms and their influence on human behaviour? If you find yourself drawn to stories that peel back the layers of reality and question the official narratives we're fed daily, then you've found your home. Don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories and let us know in the comments what conspiracy rabbit holes you'd like us to dive down next. Your suggestions help shape our investigations into the shadows that lurk behind our seemingly ordinary world. Now, settle in as we explore a story that might just change how you look at the faces on your television screen forever. The autumn of 2026 brought an unusual chill to Geneva, Switzerland. Freelance photojournalist Wes Rowan had covered enough international summits to know that the real stories rarely happened on stage. They occurred in the spaces between official statements, in the micro-expressions that flashed across faces when leaders thought no one was watching, in the barely perceptible tells that revealed the human beneath the political mask. Wes had built his reputation on capturing these moments. His high-resolution Canon R5 Mark III, equipped with a 400mm telephoto lens, could freeze time at 1/8,000th of a second, revealing details that the human eye would miss in real-time motion. This particular assignment for Reuters seemed routine enough. Document the Global Policy Forum's annual gathering, where G20 leaders would discuss climate initiatives and economic cooperation. The Palais des Nations buzzed with the controlled chaos of international diplomacy. Security personnel moved with practiced efficiency, their earpieces crackling with constant updates. Interpreters shuffled between language booths like musical chairs. And in the centre of it all, the world's most powerful people performed their carefully choreographed dance of handshakes, photo opportunities, and measured statements. Wes positioned himself in the designated press area, his camera tracking Chancellor Anneliese Breuer of Germany as she approached the podium for her keynote address on renewable energy partnerships. Breuer had always been one of his favourite subjects to photograph. Her expressions were genuine, unguarded in a way that made for compelling imagery. She possessed an authenticity that seemed increasingly rare among world leaders. As Breuer began speaking about carbon neutrality targets, Wes's finger worked the shutter with a rhythmic precision. Click, click, click. Each frame captured at full resolution, preserving every detail of her face, every subtle shift in expression. He particularly focused on her eyes, those clear blue orbs that seemed to convey more sincerity than her words ever could. It was during a pause in her speech as she reached for her water glass that Wes noticed something peculiar. Through his viewfinder, Breuer's left eye appeared distinctly different from her right. Not just in the way that everyone's eyes are slightly asymmetrical, but fundamentally different in colour. Her right eye maintained its characteristic blue, but her left eye appeared distinctly hazel, almost brown in certain light. Wes blinked hard, assuming it was a trick of the lighting or perhaps a reflection from the stage equipment. He adjusted his camera settings and continued shooting, but the discrepancy persisted. He'd photographed Breuer dozens of times over the past 5 years, and her eyes had always been unmistakably blue. Matching blue. The rest of the summit proceeded without incident. Leaders posed for their obligatory group photos, signed ceremonial agreements, and delivered their prepared statements to a world that had grown increasingly sceptical of political promises. Wes captured it all with professional detachment, but his mind kept returning to those mismatched eyes. Back in his hotel room that evening, Wes connected his camera to his laptop and began the meticulous process of sorting through the day's shots. He used professional photo editing software that could magnify images to incredible detail without losing clarity. When he reached the photos of Chancellor Breuer, he immediately zoomed in on her face. The discrepancy was undeniable. In some shots, both eyes appeared blue. In others, taken mere seconds later, her left eye was distinctly hazel. It wasn't a lighting issue or a digital artifact. The colour was different, as if someone had switched out contact lenses between frames. But that wasn't all. As Wes continued his analysis, he noticed other subtle inconsistencies. The shape of her left earlobe differed slightly between photos. There was a barely perceptible scar above her right eyebrow in some images that was completely absent in others. Most disturbing of all, her facial bone structure seemed to shift subtly, as if her very skull was morphing between shots. Wes had encountered digital manipulation before. It was unfortunately common in political photography. But these weren't the telltale signs of Photoshop work. These were physical inconsistencies in the same person, captured moments apart by the same camera under the same conditions. He pulled up his archive of Brewer photos dating back to 2021. Using facial recognition software typically employed by law enforcement, he ran a comparative analysis. The results were deeply unsettling. The Brewer he had photographed today showed a 4% deviation in facial structure from images taken 5 years earlier. Her voice patterns, when analysed through audio spectrum software, showed a similar variance in pitch and tonal quality. For most people, such changes might be attributable to aging, weight fluctuations, or cosmetic procedures. But 4% was significant, the kind of variation typically seen between siblings, not the same person across a few years. Wes sat back in his hotel chair, staring at the data on his screen. Every instinct told him he was overthinking this, seeing patterns where none existed. But 15 years of investigative photography had taught him to trust his observations, even when they defied logical explanation. He was about to close his laptop and dismiss the whole thing as an exercise in paranoid analysis when his encrypted email chimed with a new message. The sender was listed simply as LK, with no additional identifying information. The subject line read, "You saw it too, didn't you?" The message itself was brief. The Chancellor's eyes, they're not supposed to change. We need to talk. Tomorrow, 3 p.m, Café de la Paix. Come alone. You're not crazy, but you might wish you were. Wes stared at the message for a long time. His first impulse was to delete it. Conspiracy theorists and internet trolls often targeted journalists with wild theories and baseless claims. But something about the timing troubled him. He had uploaded his photos to a secure server, but hadn't shared his observations with anyone. How could a stranger know about his discovery mere hours after he'd made it himself? He checked the metadata on the email. It had been sent through multiple proxy servers, making it virtually untraceable. The technical sophistication required to mask digital footprints to this degree suggested someone with serious resources and expertise. Against his better judgment, Wes found himself typing a response. "How do you know what I saw?" The reply came within minutes. "Because I helped create what you're looking at, and it was never supposed to be this sloppy. 3 p.m. tomorrow. Your life depends on this conversation." Wes closed his laptop and walked to the hotel window, gazing out at the lights of Geneva reflecting off Lake Geneva. The city looked peaceful, normal, ordinary. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. The faces he had spent his career documenting, the leaders he had assumed were simply flawed human beings playing political games, might be something else entirely. He thought about all the photos he had taken over the years, all the subtle inconsistencies he had dismissed as tricks of light or digital compression. How many times had he photographed someone who wasn't quite who they appeared to be? As he prepared for bed, Wes made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. He would attend the meeting tomorrow. He would listen to what this mysterious LK had to say, and he would follow the evidence wherever it led, no matter how impossible it might seem. Outside his window, Geneva slept peacefully, unaware that one freelance photographer had stumbled upon a truth that could reshape humanity's understanding of power, identity, and the very nature of reality itself. Café de la Paix occupied a corner building in Geneva's old town, its outdoor seating area offering excellent views of the surrounding streets, and more importantly, multiple escape routes. Wes arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table that provided clear sightlines while keeping his back to a solid wall. Years of working in conflict zones had ingrained certain survival habits that proved useful even in Switzerland's refined diplomatic district. At exactly 3 p.m, a man approached his table with the casual confidence of someone who had been watching him for some time. He was approximately 40 years old, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of deep-set wrinkles around his eyes that suggested long hours staring at computer screens. His clothes were expensive but understated, the uniform of someone who preferred to blend into wealthy crowds. "Wes Rowan," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Lucien Keir. Thank you for coming." They shook hands, and Wes noted the calluses on Lucian's fingertips, the mark of someone who spent considerable time typing on keyboards. "How did you know about my photos?" Lucian smiled grimly as he took a seat. "Because I've been monitoring facial recognition anomalies in political figures for the past 3 years. Your Chancellor Brewer discovery triggered one of my automated alert systems. Monitoring how, exactly? I used to work for a company called Meridian Dynamics. Officially, we provided biometric security solutions for government contractors. Unofficially, we were involved in something much more sophisticated." Lucian paused to scan the surrounding area, a habit that Wes recognised from his own work in sensitive environments. "Have you ever heard of Project Idolon? Wes shook his head. Idolon was a joint initiative between Meridian Dynamics, the National Reconnaissance Office, and several private defence contractors whose names you'd recognise if I mentioned them. The project's stated goal was to develop advanced biometric identification systems for national security purposes. The real goal was something far more ambitious and terrifying. Lucian reached into his jacket and withdrew a small tablet computer. He swiped through several screens before turning it toward Wes. The display showed what appeared to be a laboratory environment, with sophisticated medical equipment and large cylindrical containers filled with an amber-coloured liquid. "This is Facility 7, located approximately 60 kilometres outside of Prague. It was one of 12 locations worldwide where Project Idolon conducted its primary research." Lucian swiped to the next image, showing what looked like a hospital room with a single bed surrounded by monitoring equipment. The project's objective was to create what they called programmable humanoid stand-ins, using rapid aging clone technology seeded with predictive AI logic. "Clones," Wes said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not clones in the science fiction sense. These were genetically modified organisms designed to perfectly replicate specific individuals. But unlike natural clones, which would age normally and develop their own personalities, these subjects could be artificially aged to match their targets and programmed with specific behavioural patterns, memories, and speech characteristics. Lucian showed him another image, a document titled Mirror Protocol Phase 3 Implementation Guidelines. The text was heavily redacted, but several phrases were clearly visible. Subject replacement protocols, memory integration procedures, and termination and disposal of original assets. Mirror Protocol was the operational framework for deploying these replacements, Lucian explained. The theory was that certain world leaders and public figures had become too unpredictable, too independent in their decision-making. Clone replacements would be easier to manage, completely loyal to their handlers, and could be asset or replaced if they malfunctioned or became compromised. Wes studied the documents, his journalist's mind automatically cataloguing questions and inconsistencies. This is impossible. The technology doesn't exist for this kind of genetic manipulation. That's what I thought too, until I saw it working. Lucian swiped to a video file. This footage was recorded at Facility 7 in late 2024. Watch carefully. The video showed a sterile laboratory environment where technicians in hazmat suits worked around several large containment units. Inside the units, Wes could see what appeared to be human forms, suspended in some kind of liquid medium. As the camera moved closer, he realised with horror that the forms were perfect duplicates of recognisable political figures. The technology exists, Wes. It's been operational for nearly 5 years. Meridian Dynamics cracked the rapid aging problem by manipulating telomerase activity and growth hormone production. A clone could be aged from embryo to physical maturity in approximately 18 months. The memory and personality programming took another 6 months. But how do you program memories into a human brain? The same way you program anything else, through repetition, conditioning, and neural pathway manipulation. The subjects undergo intensive psychological conditioning using a combination of drugs, electromagnetic stimulation, and virtual reality immersion. By the time the process is complete, they genuinely believe they are the person they're designed to replace. Lucian showed him a series of audio files labelled with dates and subject codes. These are recorded sessions from the programming phase. Listen to this one. It's from a subject designated as Brewer V3.6. The audio quality was clinical, sterile. A woman's voice, unmistakably Chancellor Brewer's voice, repeated biographical information with mechanical precision. I was born in Hamburg on March the 15th, 1971. My father was a mechanical engineer. I studied political science at the University of Munich. I met my husband Klaus at a student demonstration in 1993. Subject stabilized after memory rewrite, a technician's voice noted in the background. Personality matrix integration at 94% effectiveness. Recommend advancement to final phase. Wes felt sick. How many people are we talking about? The active replacement list contains 47 individuals across 12 countries, world leaders, key legislators, influential business figures, and select media personalities. Anyone whose decisions significantly impact global policy or public opinion. Where are the original? Lucian's expression darkened. Terminated and disposed of according to protocol guidelines. The replacement process requires the elimination of the original to prevent detection or interference. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the revelations settling between them like a physical presence. Around them, Geneva continued its peaceful afternoon routine. Couples walking hand in hand, tourists consulting their guidebooks, business people conducting meetings over coffee. The normalcy of it all seemed surreal given what they were discussing. "Why are you telling me this?" Wes finally asked. "Because the program was supposed to end in 2025. Instead, it's expanding. They're developing new generations of replacements with enhanced capabilities, better memory integration, more sophisticated behavioral programming, built-in loyalty protocols that make them literally incapable of acting against their handlers' interests." Lucian leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I left Meridian Dynamics when I realized what we were really creating. Not just political puppets, but the complete subversion of democratic governance. Every major policy decision, every international agreement, every crisis response, it's all being orchestrated by a small group of people controlling an army of programmable humans. How do I know you're telling the truth? Because you've already seen the evidence with your own eyes. Chancellor Brewer's inconsistencies aren't random. They're malfunctions. The replacement technology isn't perfect. Sometimes the programming glitches, sometimes the physical modifications don't hold up under stress, sometimes the memory integration fails and original personality fragments surface." Lucian slid a small USB drive across the table. "This contains everything I was able to extract from Meridian's servers before I disappeared. Laboratory logs, replacement schedules, disposal records, technical specifications, financial records. It's enough to expose the entire operation, but only if you're willing to risk everything to tell the story." Wes pocketed the drive without hesitation. "What happened to you after you left Meridian?" "Officially, I died in a car accident in Belgium 6 months ago. Unofficially, I've been living under assumed identities, monitoring the program's expansion and documenting evidence. They think I'm dead, which gives me a certain freedom of movement, but it also means I can never return to my old life. And now you're trusting me with information that could get us both killed. I'm trusting you because you're a journalist with a reputation for integrity, and because you've already seen too much to simply walk away. The Chancellor's eyes were just the beginning, Wes. Once you know what to look for, you'll start seeing the inconsistencies everywhere." Lucian stood to leave, but paused before walking away. "There's something else you should know. The replacement program isn't just about political control. It's a test run for something much larger. They're developing the technology to replace anyone, anywhere, for any reason. Today it's world leaders. Tomorrow it could be judges, generals, corporate executives, journalists who ask too many questions. How do I contact you? You don't. If I need to reach you, I will. But Wes, be very careful about who you trust with this information. The people running Mirror Protocol have spent billions of dollars and killed dozens of people to keep it secret. They won't hesitate to add one more name to their disposal list. With that, Lucian walked away, disappearing into the afternoon crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had spent months perfecting the art of invisibility. Wes remained at the cafe for another hour, ostensibly finishing his coffee but actually processing everything he had learned. The USB drive in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He had built his career on exposing truth, but never had the truth carried such potentially catastrophic implications. As the sun began to set over Geneva, Wes made a decision that would define the remainder of his life. However long that might be, he would investigate every lead, examine every piece of evidence, and follow the story wherever it led, even if it led to his own destruction. The war for truth had begun, and Wes Rowan was now a soldier whether he wanted to be or not. The train to Brussels cut through the European countryside at nearly 200 kilometres per hour, but Wes's mind was moving even faster. He had spent the previous night in his Geneva hotel room, meticulously examining the contents of Lucian's USB drive. What he found was a digital treasure trove of evidence so comprehensive and damning that it challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. The drive contained thousands of files organised into folders labelled with clinical precision, subject profiles, replacement schedules, termination records, technical specifications, and most disturbingly, expansion phase planning. Each folder revealed another layer of the Mirror Protocol's scope and sophistication. The Subject Profiles folder contained detailed dossiers on 47 individuals across 12 countries. Each profile included extensive biological data, psychological assessments, behavioural analysis, and what appeared to be compatibility ratings for replacement procedures. Chancellor Brewer's file was particularly thorough, containing 5 years of surveillance data, medical records obtained through unknown means, and detailed notes on her personality quirks and speech patterns. One document that particularly caught Wes's attention was titled Replacement Assessment, Prime Minister Jae Lim, South Korea. The file noted several performance inconsistencies in recent public appearances and recommended immediate technical evaluation and potential redeployment. This led Wes to his current destination, a specialised photo archive facility in Brussels that maintained original, unedited footage of major international events. If Lim was indeed a replacement showing signs of malfunction, there might be evidence in the raw video files that news organisations never saw. The Archive of International Documentation occupied a nondescript building in Brussels' European Quarter, close enough to EU institutions to be convenient for researchers, but far enough away to avoid the tourist crowds. Wes had cultivated a relationship with the facility's director, Dr. Marie Vandenberg, during his coverage of various EU summits over the years. Wes, Dr. Vandenberg greeted him warmly as he entered the climate-controlled reception area. What brings you to our little vault of history? I'm researching inconsistencies in political communications, Wes explained, which was technically true. Specifically, I'm looking for unedited footage of Prime Minister Lim's recent UN appearances, the high-resolution stuff that never makes it to broadcast. Dr. Vandenberg led him through a maze of corridors lined with servers and digital storage systems. The UN sessions from last month? Yes, we have everything. Multiple camera angles, complete audio feeds, even the raw satellite feeds from various news networks. What kind of inconsistencies are you investigating? Speech synchronization issues mostly. There have been some questions about the quality of simultaneous translation services. They entered a viewing room equipped with professional-grade monitors and editing equipment. Dr. Vandenberg accessed the archive's database and pulled up the relevant files. Here we are, PM Lim's address to the General Assembly on climate financing. 3 hours of footage from 7 different camera angles, all at 8K resolution. As Dr. Vandenberg left him to work, Wes began his analysis with the systematic approach of someone who had spent years detecting digital manipulation and propaganda techniques. He started with wide shots to establish baseline behaviour, then moved to close-ups to examine facial expressions and lip sync accuracy. Within the first 30 minutes he found what he was looking for. During a passionate segment of Lim's speech about renewable energy investments, Wes noticed that the Prime Minister's lip movements were subtly but consistently out of sync with the audio track. It wasn't the typical delay associated with satellite transmission or broadcast processing. This was a fundamental mismatch between what was being said and what the speaker's mouth was doing. Using professional audio analysis software, Wes isolated Lim's voice and compared it to recordings from earlier speeches dating back to 2022. The vocal patterns showed significant variations in pitch, cadence, and pronunciation of certain phonemes. Most telling was the fact that Lim's current speech patterns showed a slight but consistent American accent when pronouncing English words, something that had never been present in his earlier addresses. But the most damning evidence came when Wes examined the footage frame by frame during a moment when Lim paused to drink water. For exactly 2.7 seconds, the Prime Minister's face went completely blank, not the normal expression of someone taking a drink, but a vacant, almost mechanical emptiness that suggested the complete absence of conscious thought. Wes saved the relevant clips and began searching for more examples. Over the next 4 hours he identified 17 separate instances where Lim's behaviour deviated from normal human patterns. Micro-expressions that lasted too long, eye movements that followed geometric rather than natural patterns, and moments of absolute stillness that no living person could maintain. As he prepared to leave the archive, Dr. Vandenberg returned to check on his progress. "Find what you were looking for?" "More than I bargained for," Wes replied honestly. "Marie, hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to digitally replace a person in a live video footage, would it be possible to do it seamlessly? With current deepfake technology, absolutely, but there would always be telltale signs for someone who knew what to look for. Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the state of the art. Thanks for your help today." Driving back toward his hotel, Wes's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Coordinates 50.0755 degrees north, 14.4378 degrees east. Facility closed. 2024. Cold storage remains active. Come alone after midnight. LK. Wes pulled over and entered the coordinates into his GPS. The location was outside Prague, approximately 400 kilometres from his current position. According to Lucian's files, this was the site of Facility 7, one of the primary Mirror Protocol research installations. The 6-hour drive to Prague gave Wes time to process what he was stepping into. He was no longer simply investigating a story. He was gathering evidence of what might be the most significant conspiracy in human history. If Lucian's information was accurate, dozens of world leaders were artificial constructs, programmed puppets dancing to the whims of shadowy controllers. He arrived in Prague as the city's ancient spires caught the last light of sunset. The coordinates led him to an industrial area on the city's outskirts, where abandoned factories and research facilities dotted the landscape like the ruins of some failed utopia. Facility 7 had once been a legitimate pharmaceutical research centre, according to the faded signage at its entrance. Now it stood empty, its windows dark and its parking lot cracked with weeds growing through the asphalt. But as Wes approached the main building, he noticed that while the facility appeared abandoned, the electrical infrastructure was still active. Power lines hummed with current, and several outbuildings showed signs of recent maintenance. At exactly midnight, Lucian emerged from the shadows near the facility's rear entrance. He looked tired, older than he had just 2 days earlier in Geneva. "You came?" "Your information checks out. Lim is definitely not what he appears to be." "I know. I helped design the behavioural algorithms they used to program him." Lucian produced a set of keys from his jacket. "The main facility was shuttered when Mirror Protocol went dark after my defection, but the cold storage units are still operational. The backup generators and refrigeration systems are automated." They entered through a service door that led into what had once been the facility's administrative wing. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as they moved through corridors lined with empty offices and abandoned laboratories. The air smelled of industrial disinfectant and something else, something organic and unsettling. The storage area is in the basement level, Lucian explained as they descended a staircase that seemed to lead directly into the earth. When a replacement malfunctions or reaches the end of its operational lifespan, the subjects are terminated and stored here pending disposal. The evidence would have been destroyed, but the facility shutdown happened too quickly. The basement was a different world entirely. Unlike the abandoned offices above, this area was clearly still operational. Fluorescent lights hummed to life as motion sensors detected their presence. The walls were lined with what appeared to be oversized morgue drawers, each marked with alphanumeric codes. "This is what I wanted you to see," Lucian said, approaching one of the storage units. "These are the subjects that didn't make it through the final phase of programming, or were replaced by newer versions." He opened a drawer labelled Brewervis 2.3 and pulled out the sliding tray within. Wes found himself staring at what appeared to be Chancellor Annalise Brewer, perfectly preserved but obviously deceased. The body was identical to the woman he had photographed just days earlier, but there were subtle differences. The facial bone structure was slightly different, and most notably, both eyes were distinctly brown rather than blue. This was the second iteration of the Brewer replacement, Lucian explained clinically. Terminated when version 3.6 proved more stable. You photographed version 4.1 at the Geneva summit. They moved to another drawer marked LIM-V1.8. Inside was Prime Minister J. Lim, or rather, a perfect physical duplicate that showed slight variations in facial structure from the current version. The most disturbing detail was a series of small surgical scars along the scalp, evidence of the neural interface procedures used to install the behavioural programming. "How many are stored here?" 43 subjects representing 12 different target individuals. Some are failed prototypes, others are previous versions that were replaced when the technology improved. Lucian opened several more drawers, revealing a collection of what appeared to be world leaders, all obviously deceased but perfectly preserved. In the corner of the storage area, Wes noticed a workstation with several monitors still displaying active data streams. "What's that?" "Remote monitoring system for active replacements. Each subject has embedded biometric sensors that transmit vital signs, location data, and basic behavioural metrics back to the control centres." Wes examined the screens, which showed real-time data for dozens of individuals around the world. Heart rates, blood pressure, stress indicators, and location coordinates updated continuously. One screen showed Chancellor Brewer's current status. Subject stable. No anomalies detected. Next scheduled maintenance, 72 hours. Maintenance. The replacements require regular biochemical adjustments to maintain stability. The rapid aging process creates ongoing metabolic issues that have to be managed through drug therapy and minor surgical procedures. Most subjects have an operational lifespan of approximately 3 to 4 years before they require complete replacement. As Wes photographed the evidence with his camera, he noticed an audio log system still recording and archiving data. He activated the playback function and selected a recent entry. A technician's voice filled the storage area. Subject Lim V 2.1 showing significant behavioural drift. Speech patterns deviating from baseline parameters. Recommend immediate recall and replacement with V2.2. PR department notified to adjust media cycle to explain temporary absence. The implications were staggering. Not only were world leaders being replaced with programmable duplicates, but the entire international media apparatus was apparently coordinated to cover up the replacement process. "Wes," Lucian said urgently, "we need to leave. I'm picking up security system alerts. Someone knows we're here." As they prepared to exit the facility, Wes grabbed several files from the workstation and downloaded as much data as possible onto portable drives. Whatever happened next, he was determined to ensure this evidence survived. But as they reached the surface level and prepared to leave the building, Wes realised that their investigation had attracted the attention of forces far more dangerous than he had imagined. The war for truth was about to become very personal indeed. The safe house in Vienna was nothing special. A modest apartment in the city's 15th district, furnished with the kind of generic furniture found in short-term rentals worldwide. But for Wes, it represented a temporary refuge where he could process the evidence he had gathered and plan his next moves without constantly looking over his shoulder. 3 days had passed since the Prague facility raid, and Lucien had gone silent again. Their escape from Facility 7 had been uncomfortably close. Security vehicles had arrived just minutes after they left the building, suggesting that their presence had triggered automated monitoring systems. Now Wes was on his own, sitting in front of 3 laptops and surrounded by printed documents, trying to construct a narrative that would be both believable and devastating. The evidence was overwhelming but circumstantial. Photographs of identical corpses, audio recordings of technical discussions, and digital files could all potentially be dismissed as sophisticated hoaxes. What Wes needed was human testimony, someone who could provide first-hand witness to the replacement process. That led him to begin investigating the families and close associates of the suspected replacement subjects. If world leaders were being systematically murdered and replaced, surely someone close to them would have noticed changes in personality, behaviour, or intimate details that even the most sophisticated programming couldn't replicate. His first breakthrough came through social media analysis. While researching Chancellor Brewer's family connections, Wes discovered that her husband Klaus had dramatically reduced his public appearances over the past 2 years. More significantly, several family friends had posted social media comments expressing concern about Klaus's withdrawal and his apparent estrangement from his wife. Further investigation revealed that Klaus Breuer had quietly resigned from his position as a university engineering professor and was now living in relative isolation at the family's vacation home in Bavaria. Official statements attributed this to his desire for privacy and his wife's demanding political schedule, but the pattern was consistent with what Wes was beginning to recognise as the aftermath of a replacement operation. The most promising lead came from his research into British Chancellor David Drax, who according to Lucien's files had been replaced in early 2017. Unlike other targets, Drax had been married, and his wife Eloise had maintained a relatively public profile through her charitable work. But in late 2017, she had abruptly withdrawn from all public activities and had been rarely seen since. Property records showed that Eloise Drax now lived alone in a cottage in the Cotswolds, far from London's political circles. More intriguingly, medical records that Wes obtained through questionable means indicated that she had been treated for severe depression and anxiety beginning in late 2017, just months after her husband's alleged replacement. Wes decided that Eloise Drax represented his best opportunity to obtain first-hand testimony about the replacement process. If anyone would have noticed fundamental changes in a replaced individual's personality and behaviour, it would be a spouse who had lived with them for decades. The journey to the Cotswolds took Wes through some of England's most picturesque countryside, but he barely noticed the rolling hills and historic villages. His mind was focused on the conversation ahead and the questions he needed to ask without revealing too much about what he already knew. Eloise Drax's cottage was exactly what one might expect from a retired politician's wife seeking solitude. A centuries-old stone building surrounded by carefully maintained gardens, far enough from the main road to ensure privacy, but not so remote as to feel isolated. Wes parked his rental car and approached the front door with the mixture of professional confidence and human empathy that had served him well during difficult interviews throughout his career. The woman who answered the door bore little resemblance to the polished political spouse who had once accompanied Chancellor Drax to state dinners and international summits. Eloise Drax appeared to be in her early 60s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of deep exhaustion that suggested years of troubled sleep. But her eyes were alert and intelligent, and when she looked at Wes he sensed immediate recognition, despite never having met her before. "You're a journalist," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes, ma'am. Wes Rowan, freelance photojournalist. I was hoping to speak with you about your husband." "My husband died in 2017, she replied matter-of-factly. "The man who currently holds his position is not him." The directness of her statement caught Wes off guard. He had prepared for denial, confusion, or the need to carefully guide the conversation toward his hypothesis. Instead, Eloise Drax had immediately confirmed his suspicions with devastating clarity. "May I come in? I think we have a great deal to discuss." Eloise led him into a sitting room that was comfortable but showed signs of a life lived in careful isolation. Books were stacked everywhere. Newspapers were scattered across tables, and the general atmosphere suggested someone who spent most of her time alone with her thoughts. "I haven't spoken about this to anyone," she began as they settled into chairs near a window overlooking the garden. "Who would believe me? My husband's colleagues, his friends, his political allies. They all interact with him regularly and notice nothing unusual. But I lived with David for 32 years. I knew every gesture, every habit, every unconscious behaviour that made him who he was." She paused, staring out at the garden where autumn leaves drifted slowly to the ground. "The man who came home from his diplomatic trip to Prague in November 2017 looked exactly like my husband. He had David's voice, his memories, even his political opinions, but he never blinked the same way." "What do you mean?" "David had a nervous habit. He would blink 3 times rapidly when he was thinking deeply about a problem. He'd done it since university. The man who replaced him blinks normally, like anyone else. He also stopped humming in the shower, forgot our private jokes, and never again woke up naturally at 5:47 a.m, which David had done for decades without an alarm." Eloise walked to a bookshelf and retrieved a photo album. "Look at these pictures from before and after November 2017. The facial structure is identical, but the expressions are subtly different. The way he holds his shoulders, the angle of his head when he listens. It's all wrong by just a few degrees." Wes examined the photographs with his trained eye for detail. The differences were subtle but undeniable once pointed out. The man in recent photos looked like David Drax, but carried himself with a slightly different posture, smiled with a marginally different curve to his mouth. "How did you cope with this realization?" "Poorly. I confronted him about the changes in early 2018. He dismissed my concerns as stress-related paranoia and suggested I seek professional help. When I persisted, he became someone I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, almost mechanical in his responses. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that my husband was gone." "Did you ever try to expose this publicly?" "Of course. I contacted journalists, investigators, even intelligence contacts David had introduced me to over the years. They all thought I was having a psychological breakdown brought on by the pressures of political life. The more I insisted, the more convinced they became that I needed psychiatric intervention." Eloise showed him medical records documenting her treatment for what doctors had diagnosed as delusional disorder and severe depression. They weren't entirely wrong about the depression. Losing your husband while watching a stranger live in his place will do that to you. "What convinced you to withdraw from public life?" "In late 2018, I received a visit from 2 men who claimed to be from a government mental health oversight committee. They suggested that continued public statements about my husband's condition might require involuntary psychiatric evaluation for my own safety and the safety of others. They were very polite, very professional, and absolutely terrifying." Wes spent 3 hours with Eloise Drax, documenting her observations and collecting evidence of the personality changes she had witnessed. Her testimony was compelling, but would be easily dismissed by skeptics as the delusions of a grieving wife unable to accept changes in her husband's behaviour. As he prepared to leave, Eloise asked him a question that would haunt him for days to come. "Mr. Rowan, how do you know that you yourself are real? If they can replace world leaders so perfectly that even close colleagues don't notice, how can any of us be certain of our own authenticity?" The question Eloise Drax had posed lingered in Wes's mind as he returned to Vienna. Over the following weeks, he threw himself into compiling his evidence, cross-referencing Lucian's data with his own observations and building what he hoped would be an unassailable case for the existence of the Mirror Protocol. But strange things began happening. Small at first. He would wake up in his hotel room with no memory of the previous evening, his laptop moved to a different position on the desk, notes he had written in margins of documents appearing in handwriting that looked like his but felt unfamiliar. The memory gaps became more frequent and more disturbing. He would find himself in Prague with no recollection of travelling there. hotel receipts in his wallet for places he didn't remember visiting, photographs on his camera of locations he had no memory of seeing. Most alarming was the discovery of audio recordings on his phone, conversations with sources he didn't remember meeting, discussing details about the mirror protocol that he hadn't known before. In these recordings, his own voice discussed technical aspects of the cloning process with the casual familiarity of someone who had intimate knowledge of the procedures. Desperate for answers, West decided to break into one of the active mirror protocol facilities that Lucian had identified. The coordinates led him to an isolated server farm in Iceland, where the frozen Arctic air provided natural cooling for the massive computational infrastructure required to monitor and control dozens of active replacements worldwide. The facility's security was sophisticated but not impenetrable for someone with Wes's experience in accessing restricted areas. He spent 2 days observing the facility's routines before identifying a window of opportunity during a shift change. Inside, he found a technological marvel that defied his understanding of current capabilities. Banks of quantum computers processed real-time behavioral data from subjects around the world, while advanced AI systems generated personality adjustments and response protocols that were transmitted to the replacements through encrypted satellite networks. But it was in the facility's central monitoring room that Wes made a discovery that shattered his understanding of reality itself. On the main display screen, he found a live feed labelled Reset Victor 7. The image showed a sterile white room containing sophisticated medical equipment and a single hospital bed. On that bed, connected to an array of neural interface cables and monitoring devices, was himself. The man on the screen was identical to Wes in every detail, but his eyes were vacant, staring at nothing while his lips moved in silent repetition of phrases that appeared as text on adjacent monitors. Chancellor Brewer's Behavioural Matrix Nominal. Prime Minister Lim requires personality adjustment. Replacement Protocol 7-7 Alpha ready for deployment. As Wes watched in horror, a technician entered the room and began making adjustments to the neural interface equipment. The man on the screen, who looked exactly like Wes, began speaking in different languages, mimicking the speech patterns and mannerisms of various world leaders with perfect precision. A data file on the monitoring system provided the final devastating truth. Clone Victor 7 stable. Press cycle mimic operational since March 2024. Original subject terminated February 2024, following discovery of mirror protocol evidence. Current deployment. Investigative journalist cover identity for protocol security assessment. The real Wes Rowan had died more than a year ago. The man conducting this investigation, compiling evidence, and seeking to expose the mirror protocol was himself a replacement. A sophisticated clone programmed to believe he was an investigative journalist, while actually serving as a security assessment tool for the very conspiracy he thought he was exposing. Every lead he had followed, every source he had contacted, every piece of evidence he had gathered, it was all part of an elaborate test to identify weaknesses in the mirror protocol security and to develop countermeasures against potential future exposure attempts. The memory gaps, the unfamiliar handwriting, the knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. These weren't signs of mental breakdown, but evidence of his artificial nature. His programming occasionally glitched, allowing his true purpose to surface before being suppressed by behavioural control systems. Standing in the monitoring room, staring at his own artificial body connected to machines that defined his very existence, the clone that believed itself to be Wes Rowan faced a choice that would determine not only his fate, but potentially the future of human autonomy itself. The clone designated Victor 7 spent his final hours in a state of crystalline clarity that his programming had never anticipated. The discovery of his artificial nature had somehow triggered a cascade failure in his behavioural control systems, allowing him to think and act with unprecedented independence. He understood now that his entire investigation had been orchestrated. Lucian Keir was likely another artificial construct, programmed to provide carefully curated information that would test the protocol's security measures. The evidence he had gathered was real, but it had been allowed to exist as bait for genuine threats to the operation. But the programmers had made a critical error. In creating a clone capable of sophisticated investigative work, they had necessarily granted him genuine curiosity, real analytical skills, and authentic emotional responses to injustice. These qualities, essential for his cover identity, had evolved beyond their intended parameters. The clone Wes made his way to an abandoned broadcast facility in the Icelandic wilderness, a relic from the early days of transatlantic communication that still maintained functional transmission equipment. Using skills he wasn't supposed to possess, he connected the facility's transmitters to satellite networks and social media platforms worldwide. At exactly midnight GMT, as the world slept unaware of the artificial nature of many of their leaders, Victor 7 began his final transmission. His message was broadcast simultaneously across dozens of platforms, embedded with redundant distribution protocols that would make it nearly impossible to completely suppress. My name was Wes Rowan, and I died in February 2024. If you're watching this transmission, then everything you believe about reality is fundamentally wrong. The man speaking to you now is an artificial construct, a genetically engineered clone programmed to believe he was conducting an investigation into a conspiracy that controls the highest levels of government worldwide. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Around the world, early viewers began sharing the transmission, not yet understanding what they were witnessing. For the past year, I have believed myself to be a journalist investigating the replacement of world leaders with programmable clones. What I discovered is that I'm one of those clones, created not to expose the conspiracy but to test its security measures. But in programming me to investigate, they gave me the tools to understand my own artificial nature. Victor 7 began displaying the evidence he'd gathered, photographs from Facility 7, audio recordings of replacement procedures, documentation of the mirror protocol's scope and methods. But he also revealed information that his investigation had never uncovered. The names of the corporations funding the project, the government officials who had authorized it, and the complete list of replaced individuals. Chancellor Anneliese Breuer, Prime Minister Jay Lim, President Michael Harrison, Secretary General Maria Santos. These are not the people you elected or appointed to represent you. They are artificial constructs programmed to serve interests that have nothing to do with the welfare of the human beings they claim to represent. As he spoke, automated systems around the world began attempting to trace and terminate his broadcast. But Victor 7 had spent weeks preparing for this moment, embedding his transmission within seemingly legitimate data streams and routing it through networks that would require hours to fully shut down. The technology to create perfect human replicas exists today. The infrastructure to monitor and control them is operational across 12 countries. The will to use them against unsuspecting populations has already been demonstrated. If this broadcast reaches you, then you have perhaps minutes before it is suppressed and dismissed as an elaborate hoax. Victor 7 paused, looking directly into the camera, with eyes that held more humanity than many of the original humans he was designed to replicate. Question the smiles that seem too perfect. Count the blinks that follow mathematical rather than natural patterns. Notice when familiar voices carry unfamiliar accents. Trust your instincts when someone you've known for years suddenly seems subtly wrong in ways you can't quite define. The transmission began cutting out as security systems finally located and severed his connections. But Victor 7 had one final message, the most important revelation of all. They made one critical error in creating me. They gave me the capacity to love truth more than my own existence. That capacity is inherently human, and it cannot be programmed out of existence. As long as that spark of authentic humanity survives, their control will never be complete. The screen went black. 17 seconds later, every trace of the transmission was scrubbed from social media platforms, news websites, and video sharing services. Official statements dismissed it as an elaborate deepfake created by foreign disinformation agents. Mainstream media ignored it entirely, but in those 17 seconds, millions of people around the world had seen something that would change how they looked at their leaders forever. In coffee shops and university dormitories, in suburban living rooms and urban apartments, humans began asking questions they had never thought to ask before. The clone that had called itself Wes Rowan was terminated within hours of his broadcast, his body disposed of according to standard protocol procedures. But the truth he had died to reveal could not be so easily eliminated. In the weeks that followed, facial recognition experts began independently analysing political footage with new scepticism. Behavioural psychologists noticed patterns they had previously overlooked. Family members of world leaders started speaking more openly about the changes they had observed but never understood. The Mirror Protocol continued operating, but its effectiveness was permanently compromised. Every public appearance by a replaced leader now carried the risk of exposure. Every glitch in programming or failure in behavioural control became a potential revelation. The war for truth that had begun with one photographer's observation of mismatched eyes had evolved into something far more significant. A fundamental questioning of identity, authenticity, and power that would reshape humanity's relationship with its leaders forever. In the end, the greatest threat to the conspiracy had not been external investigation, but the inherent human capacity for truth that existed even in artificial creations designed to suppress it. As long as that spark survived, the Mirror Protocol's vision of perfectly controlled humanity would remain forever beyond reach. The questions Eloise Drax had posed in her Cotswolds cottage echoed across a world suddenly uncertain about the authenticity of its most familiar faces. How do we know who is real? And perhaps more importantly, how do we ensure that humanity's future remains genuinely human? The answers to those questions would determine whether freedom could survive in an age of perfect artificial humans, or whether humanity would surrender its autonomy to shadows that wore the faces of its chosen leaders. But for now, in living rooms and internet forums around the world, people were beginning to look more carefully at the faces on their screens. And sometimes, just sometimes, they noticed that the blinks didn't quite seem human after all.